Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Vanessa Lewinger. As Leslie mentioned, I am a human resources professional. I work with law for small business, and throughout my career, I've had the pleasure of working with small and growing businesses to help them create a strong HR foundation to support their growth. And so today, I hope that I can help you to achieve the same. Today, we're going to go over the essential elements of the employee file. We'll start with employee file basics, move into paper versus electronic, and getting organized. We'll go over the different file types and what to do with files when the employees leave. So if you've ever spoken with a professional of human resources, I have no doubt that they have told you to document everything. Throughout the employee life cycle, employers will collect all kinds of documentation for each employee. And today we're going to talk about how to organize those documents, what you should do, what not to keep in those files, and what to do with those files when the employee leaves the company. So, employee file basics. First and foremost, you should consider all the information held within the employee file to be confidential material, and it should always be stored in a secure location. You don't want them stored somewhere that just anyone can get into. You want to make sure that they are locked up as well. You want to restrict access to those files as well. So the Human Resources Department will act as the gatekeeper to those files. They'll grant access to those who need it. Folks that may need access are people like managers, and not just any manager, of course. You want the manager of that particular employee. They can have access to the file, but they should always be requesting it through a human resources representative. The other folks that can have access to the file are the employees themselves. So really, if there's a document in the file, the employee should already know what it is. They either would have given you that information to put in the file, or it would have been reviewed with them prior to putting it in the file, like in the case of something like a disciplinary action or a performance review. You never want to allow employees to remove any information from those files. And if they do get access, you want to be kind of monitoring them and make sure that you're still controlling the documents. The other thing to consider is consistency in the type of documentation we're putting into the files, as well as how the files are physically organized. So creating standardized forms will help to maintain that consistency, always using the same form for things like performance reviews or disciplinary actions or rate changes, that sort of thing. It takes a little bit more time to create that documentation in the beginning, but then once you have it, it will really make things really smooth for you going forward. The other thing that you want to do consistently is how you actually organize the documents within those files. So having an order to each file is going to be helpful when you need to jump into a file and grab something quickly. Keeping them in chronological order is also very helpful. We never want documentation that reflects someone's opinion or uses disrespectful language. So we're always going to use unbiased and factual information when we're adding that to our documents. Every document that goes into the file should be respectfully and professionally written, containing factual and unbiased information, and preferably that can be tied back to a policy or procedure that your organization follows. So, for example, you never want, if a manager leaves a Post-it on your desk that says, Jane is a lazy employee, she never gets to work on time, she clearly doesn't know how to work an alarm clock, we're terminating her. You wouldn't just put that Post-it in the file. You would want to draft a termination report that states something more along the lines of, Jane has continuously violated our attendance policy, and listing the dates that those violations happened. Send that back to the manager for review and approval, and then you would put that into the employee's file. And this is going to be really important because we always want to have the documents support employer decisions. We want to make sure that we have all the documentation we need. If ever someone were to come, an agency like the EEOC sends you a claim stating that Jane has filed a discrimination claim based on her sex as a woman and her age because she's over 40. So at that point, you as the employer would need to defend or prove that you terminated her not because of her sex and age, but rather because she violated policy. So that's when that non-biased factual information is going to be really important, because if you just have a post-it that says she's lazy and doesn't know how to set an alarm clock, then you're supporting her claim of discrimination rather than supporting your own claim of rightful termination. And then finally, the complexity of your organizational system may vary. So depending on the size of your company, the industry that you're in, and any special requirements that you may have to follow because of those things, you may not have the same setup that we're about to go over now. So just know that it's not one size fits all, and we can make adjustments based on our particular needs. So we're going to look at paper versus electronic. Keep in mind that in general, employers are able to maintain files in any format that works best for them or their organization, but there may be federal, state, and local requirements that you have to consider when you're developing your organizational system. So make sure that you check in with the agencies that may have some say in what you're doing. For instance, if you are a construction company and you're working under a federal contract, you may have to follow Davis-Bacon standards, and those requirements be more specific than what we're going to go over now. So just make sure you check in there. When we're looking at paper files, we want to make sure that they're always locked in a file cabinet. Again, we don't want just anyone in the organization being able to access those files, reviewing things that are in there, or putting things in those files that shouldn't be there or that don't follow the general guidelines we just went over. Even better, if you have human resources department with a door that closes, you want to put that locked file cabinet inside that office and lock that door every night. So just make sure everything's really secured and kept confidential. If you're working with electronic files, there are a few different options. You may have a software provider that you use for things like your payroll that also has a human resources information system built into it. So in those cases, of course, those individuals who need access to it will have their own unique username and password. Always want to password protect things, which will already be built into that software system. The other option, if you're working in something like G Suite, you have a Google Drive or something like that, you can create different drives within that drive and then give folks who need access to those documents. Getting organized. How you organize your employee files is just as important as what you put in them. It's easy to see why employers would think that there's just one employee file where everything goes, but it's not the case. Maintaining separate files for personal and sensitive information decreases the opportunity for misuse of that information. And so we're going to take some time and look at the different file types that you should have for each employee. And again, remember, depending on the size of your company, industry, that sort of thing, some of these files may be consolidated. Personnel file. This is the file that we automatically think of when we think of an employee file. It contains documents related to the employee life cycle. So everything from recruitment, new hire, employee status change, performance evaluation, training, termination, all those things are going to be held within this file. So it really gives you a history of that employee within your organization. Folks that should have access to this particular file are going to be the human resources folks, the managers, or the individuals responsible for that role, managers, and of course the employee. And some things we should never put in here are going to be things like medical information, credit information, immigration forms, documents related to complaints or investigations that are currently happening. And so this is just kind of very generic information that's not too sensitive. Payroll records, if it's related to money, it belongs in this file. So we're talking about things like W-4 forms, pay authorizations, payroll deductions, timesheets, attendance, historical tax information, unemployment insurance claims, garnishments, child support orders. So by creating a separate file for these payroll items, we're able to give different departments like the accounting department access to that information as they need it. Some organizations don't have human resources handle the payroll portion of that. So this would be a situation where you would definitely want to create a separate file to do that. To store the payroll information. And so it's important to make sure that if you are delegating this file to accounting, that they understand it should be secure, the file should be secured, and that it is confidential information. But that way it allows control of these files to belong with the accounting department, and they don't always have to come to human resources anytime they have a question. What it does sometimes create is a need to duplicate information. So if the human resources department doesn't have access to the payroll records, then you might want to take a copy of something like a pay rate change and add that to the employee's personnel file. Also, if payroll processing is handled in the HR department, then there's less of a need to create this separate payroll file. You would just kind of combine this into the personnel file, but still organize it in a way where personnel information and payroll information are kind of separated. And there's a bunch of different file types that you can buy that actually have built-in separators and all of that to really help you stay organized as much as possible. We have the benefits and medical records. So because of specific protections health documents have under HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, these records should always be stored in a separate and secured file. No one in the organization should really need access to this except for the Human Resources Department or those responsible for that function. But there may be times where the Human Resources Department needs to communicate certain information to managers. So for instance, if we have something like an FMLA request, Family and Medical Leave Act request, where someone needs time off because they're sick, we wouldn't be sharing the specifics of what's going on with that employee. We would just tell the manager, this employee is going to be out on leave and what dates they'll be out on leave. But any other information should stay just in that file with the Human Resources Department. So in this file, we're looking at things like medical, dental, vision, insurance, enrollment forms, life insurance enrollment, and beneficiary forms, FMLA requests and related documentation, other leave requests. If your company has fewer than 50 employees, you may not need to comply with the FMLA, but perhaps you have a separate maternity, paternity leave or something similar, and you still require documentation. That stuff would go in here. Any doctor's notes, if an employee, or if you have a policy, your attendance policy states that if an employee is out for 2 or more days, they need to bring in a doctor's note. This doctor's note wouldn't go in, say, the payroll file. It would come here because lots of times there is protected information on those notes. OSHA related reports or documentation, workers' compensation claims, first report of injury or doctor's notes, and release of duty documentation should be in here. And then, COVID related information. Of course, we're all hearing about positive tests and that sort of thing. So those notifications would go in here as well as any immunization documentation if you're requiring folks to share that with you. Internal investigation files. So if it requires an investigation, it should be in a completely separate file. Each investigation should have its own file. Lots of times when we have these investigations, it requires a lot of documentation. So of course, we're going to have the initial claim. We're going to have a statement from the person making that claim. And then we're going to want to interview the person being accused. We want to interview witnesses. We want to make sure that we have a central location to put all of this documentation, because the last thing we want to do is file Jane's statement in John's file, and then he asks for access, and now he has access to all this confidential information. So super important to have a separate file on hand and to make sure that we don't have any of those misfilings happening. There may be a time where you would have particular document, like a disciplinary action, that would go directly into an employee file as a result of the investigations findings. So that's really the only time that we would be putting something like that into an employee file. And that's just to document, this person violated a policy and they are being written up for it. You could keep a copy of that in the investigation file as well, if you wanted to. We should also have a separate file for all of our employees' I-9 forms. And I'm going to take some time to really dig into this. I-9 is the employment eligibility verification form. It is a required form. Employers must collect one from every single new hire. And what it's telling you is that the employee is authorized and eligible to work in the US. So this form is a multi-part form. It does contain a bunch of time-sensitive information, but also a bunch of sensitive information. And so we want to make sure it's secure, of course. And then incomplete or improper completion of an I-9 form can result in serious penalties, and audits by immigration and customs enforcement are super common. So that's why I really want to spend some time looking at this form. It's not complicated. It's just that you get penalized for everything that's not completed correctly. And unfortunately, it is a big topic that keeps, immigration is a huge topic of conversation. And so these audits are really, really frequent. Section 1, employee information and attestation. So section 1 is made up of 4 parts. They're to be completed. All parts are to be completed by the employee and can be done so with the help of a translator when necessary. This section must be completed on the employee's hire date. So the first day that they're coming into work for pay, you want to make sure that they complete this form. This is a little screenshot of the first section. And so within the section, we're really just collecting basic employee information. And I've highlighted 3 sections that are voluntary. So they're not required. The social security number, the employee email address, and then the employee's telephone number are not required for a standard I-9 form. If you are e-verifying, and e-verify is an electronic way to submit the information that we collect on the I-9 form. So if you are either required to do this because of the industry that you're in, or you are voluntarily doing this for all of your employees, you want to make sure that you do collect the social security number, email address, and telephone numbers, because those will be required for e-verify. If you're just collecting I-9 forms, you don't really need to submit anything. You're just really holding these files on premises to prove that you have checked verified eligibility of all your employees. Here's the second and third parts of section 1. The employee will select their citizenship status and provide additional details where required. Don't forget to make sure the employee signs to validate this information. When you see the full form, this isn't exactly where you would expect to see the signature spot. So I like to point it out because it is sometimes missed. The other important thing to note here is under option 4, the alien authorization to work until and the expiration date. So if this section is completed, there is going to be some additional work for the employer to do when we get close to this expiration date. But otherwise, normally we just complete it and store it until we need to pull it out for an audit, or if the employee terminates. employment. This is the final part of section 1, the employee information and attestation section. It's a little bit deceiving because it's in gray. We kind of think like, okay, we're done now. But actually, we want to make sure that the employee checks one of these boxes, either that they did not use a translator or that they did use a translator. This is definitely a section that you will get dinged for if it is not complete. And it's missed all the time. I miss it. And I've been working with I-9 forms for a very long time, but it is a new section. I think as of a couple of years ago, the last update that they did, this was added. And then finally down the bottom here, if a translator was used or someone helped to prepare the form, their information does need to be logged down below. Okay, now we're moving on to the second page of the I-9 form. This is the employer or authorized representative review and verification section. Section 2 and 3 are to be completed by the employer or authorized representative of the employer. So the employer can appoint anyone to be an authorized representative to sign off on this I-9 form, though it's best to have someone like a notary or someone in a manager position serve as this role. You want to make sure it's someone who can follow the rules that need to be followed to complete this form. So an authorized representative is often used when hiring a remote employee or someone who's working out of state, because part of the requirement of completing this form is that the representative has to physically examine the documents. So either one document from list A or a combination of one document from list B and one document from list C. There is an additional page, there are several pages for this I-9 form, but I think the third page includes a list of acceptable documentation. So you're going to want to make sure you give that to your new hires, preferably before their start date. So when they do start, they can come with that documentation. And so this middle section where it shows list A, B, and C, this is where you're going to take down the information from those documents and log them here. There is a rule where you can either make photocopies of those documents or not for all I-9s that are completed. So it's important to decide what method you're going to do, the photocopy or not photocopy, and consistently apply that rule every time you have a new hire. I tend to not do photocopies because I'm worried that someday I will forget to do a photocopy and then we'll be audited and then I'll get dinged for not having a photocopy. So it's usually a little bit less complicated, I think, if you don't take copies. And then also, we're not counterfeit specialists. So I'd hate to have a copy of a document that isn't authentic, that I didn't catch, and then have that also used against me in an audit. I've highlighted up here the employee information section because what you're supposed to do is take the information the employee entered in section 1 on the first page and enter it here. So pretty simple. It's just last name, first name, and middle initial, and then their immigration status. You would just write the number down that they put on the previous page, but this is again one of those sections that's often missed or the names are not where they should be. So it's just not a difficult form, but you have to be really particular. You have to be very detail oriented and make sure that you don't miss anything here. My final note on this page is about COVID precautions. So because of the ongoing precautions being taken under COVID, the Department of Homeland Security is allowing for some flexibility around the physical inspection of the IDs for employees working remotely. So if you're hiring someone to work 100% remotely, like you're not meeting face-to-face to do the onboarding, you can take photocopies at that point, review, make sure that it looks reasonably authentic. And then when you come back to working in the office, you would do a physical inspection there. So You would just note that in the additional instruction, or excuse me, additional information section here, that you did a virtual review, and then again, when you would do the normal one. So this exemption was put into place, I believe it was in March of 2020, and they have extended it periodically over this past year, more than a year now. The current exemption is good through the end of May. So I would definitely recommend going and checking that as we move out of May to make sure that you're still in compliance. The final part of section 2 is where the employer authorized representative would sign off. So again, very simple. You just want to make sure not to miss that you need to put the employer's, the employee's first date of hire. You need to list that here. That's just going to be pretty much the day that they're filling it out, we hope. And then you would put your signature and fill in the rest of the information. So this section does need to be completed within 3 business days of hire. That's the other time-sensitive piece here. If the employee is not able to produce acceptable documentation within those 3 days, then you basically have to rescind the offer of employment until they can produce those documents, or just, find somebody else. It is that big of a deal. You will get in some major trouble if you do not have this completed within that time frame. Another pro tip that I like to share here is, if you have the same person completing this form, the same authorized employee or HR representative, you can pre-populate their information here. You can also pre-populate the business's information, so you're not having to, handwrite this every time you complete one, because that could be timely. It could take a lot of time to do that if you're hiring a lot of people. The re-verification and rehire section 3, it's used for things like a name change, if you're rehiring an employee. And for rehires, you're able to use the same I-9 form if the rehire is within 3 years of the date the form was originally completed. So this is great for businesses that have seasonal employees. You need to ramp up for the holidays, so you're hiring somebody for a short amount of time and then you terminate them, but they'll be back next year. So you can reuse this for that sort of situation. And then the final thing here, that last section C, this is where you would update employment authorization information that has expired. So this would go back to the first page completed by the employee when they were listing their citizenship status. If they chose that option number 4, and they listed an expiration date, which they should, you would definitely need to come back and update this when that original document expired. So another pro tip, if you do receive an I-9 with that section checked off, you want to make sure to go into your calendar and just set up a reminder to check in with that employee. I'd give it about a month out, so that you can remind the employee and you can get an idea of when they'll be having that documentation ready. And then finally, the last thing here, if you do complete anything in section 3, you will need to sign and date that. For the I-9 form, there are some pretty specific storage rules. What I like to do is always be prepared for an audit. So I keep those I-9 files separate from the employee files. I usually get a binder or a set of binders, depending on how many employees you have within your organization. Of course, if you're doing it electronically, then you would just do kind of 2 separate file folders in your I-9 form file. And you're going to keep the active employees and the terminated employees separate. The separation reduces the risk of additional questions from auditors based on content that they may find in the other personnel files. So that's why it's so important to keep this one really, really separate and treat it a little bit differently than the other files, because it is an item that is frequently audited. So we never want to kind of open ourselves up to any more risk than we need to. And by being able to just hand over a couple of binders rather than, sifting through employee files or handing over, God forbid, the whole file, this just keeps things much more secure. Something that I also recommend is doing an internal audit. So anytime there's a change of someone in your HR department, whoever handles this, incoming person should be doing an audit of these I-9 forms just to make sure that their predecessor did complete everything and to, catch any mistakes that may have been made. I also recommend doing an annual internal audit. And, I kind of scoff at it myself, like, well, I know what I'm doing. I've completed all these forms. Of course, they're perfect. They're not. Inevitably, we find something. I mean, all these little areas that I highlighted today that are frequently missed, these are things that I miss too. And so it is really good to do an internal audit just to double check your own work. Inevitably, you find something. And then also a tip too, if immigration does come to your office wanting to audit your documents, know that you have I believe it's 3 business days to provide them with that information. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend just handing over those binders, when they come knocking. I would take that time to do a quick review of your documentation and see if there's anything that you may have missed in your annual audits and get those updated prior to handing the documents over to immigration. And then finally, there are very specific retention rules for these documents that you should follow. You have 3 years after the date of hire or 1 year after the date employment ends, whichever is later. So for example, if you hired an employee and they work for you for 1 year, then you're going to be hanging on to that document for 2 more years. And then if you had an employee that worked for you for 10 years, you would only hang on to the I-9 for 1 more year. So what I like to do is I have a spreadsheet that lists all the employees, their dates of hire, and then I just set it up for the columns to populate what those 1 year versus 3 years is. And then I have another column actually with a termination date. So anytime I terminated an employee, I go in there and I update that. And then it populates those retention dates for me. And I go in monthly and I review and make sure that I am destroying these documents as soon as I'm able to, because the other thing I'm trying to avoid is having a terminated employee's file reviewed and we're finding errors there that don't need to be found because we should have destroyed the document months ago. So just another pro tip there. And then the only people that should have access to this document are HR staff. There's never going to be a time when a manager says, hey, can I see, Joe's I-9 form? If they ask that, it's a strange question. And I would deny them access for that request. What to do with files when employment ends. So files of terminated employees should always be kept separate from those files of active employees. You want to keep the same guidelines that you have for your active employee files. So, you don't want to just consolidate all the files now that they're terminated. We're just going to throw in the benefits files and the I-9s and investigation information all in the same file because the employee is terminated. No, we still want to keep them in their separate sections, but we do want to remove them from the main active employee population of files just to make sure that there's no confusion. And again, you're protecting information. There's no misuse of that information and that you're not violating any applicable laws in any way. So I've listed here some of the most common documents that we have for employees and what their retention limits are. We have resumes at 1 year, payroll records 3 to 4 years, W-4s 4 years, performance reviews 2 years, drug test results for 1 year, requests for reasonable accommodation through the Americans with Disability Act or otherwise, 1 year, FMLA documentation, 3 years, termination records, 1 year. So it's kind of all over the place. So a good pro tip is to look at the documents that you commonly retain or that you commonly have for all of your employees, and find the latest date. So like for this example, we have the payroll documents. You need to retain those for 4 years. So then we're going to look at the 4-year mark is when we're going to destroy all of these documents. And it just makes it easier for you. So you're not having to go in, and these are not as crucial as, say, the I-9 forms where I'm like, destroy as soon as you can. We don't get as many audits for this type of information as we do for the I-9. So it would be okay to kind of apply that rule across the board here.
When you were talking about destroying the slides, I mean the files, and I know you said slides and files and stuff. If it's on the cloud, how do you go about doing that? Do you have to have documentation that you've done that? I mean, do you just hit delete, or what do you do?
When we're no longer needing to retain the files?
Yeah, if we're storing them electronically, do we just hit delete on our computer? And is that all we do?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much, or move to a trash can and then make sure that you're, emptying that trash can right away, because it is very sensitive information most of the time. There's social security numbers and dates of birth and a number of other things. So yeah, or checking in with your IT person. I know it feels very strange. I still, technology, I was born before it was as big as it is now. And so I feel like there's always a trace. But these are, there are guidelines that allow us to do these things electronically. So I think if you're working with an IT person, checking in with them just to make sure that those things are being cleared out of the system completely. But for the most part, yeah, you would just hit delete.
That just seems easy to, as long as you get it in the right year, I guess. And what do you do? Do you do a lot of backup? Let's say you're a small business owner and you're running a small restaurant, but you still have a lot of employee forms that need to be taken care of. Do you suggest storing the backup copies in a, let's say it's, you have it in a file cabinet, it's locked, it's in a locked room. What do you suggest to do with making backups and where to store the backups?
And specifically, are we talking paper files?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that generally there are backups of those files. So, when we think back to before technology, or I guess even today, we don't have backups of those. We have the originals, and those are usually the only ones that we have, unless we are storing them in something like our payroll software programs that allow us to upload some of that documentation. So that could be an option if you're concerned about losing that information. I mean, there could be a fire. It's like there's no guarantees, right? But that's definitely something that you could do. Many of the payroll processing softwares that I think most companies are utilizing in some form do have the ability to store the essential documents like the I-9 and the tax forms. Maybe not so much things like a disciplinary action or a performance review. I'm like, progress report, performance review. Sometimes those are services or features of software programs that are at an additional cost. So there isn't always the option to do it for those, but you could, if you felt like you wanted to back up your paper documents, you could put them on a cloud server or something like that too, but it's not required. And I'm sure that there is guidance on what to do if that documentation is destroyed. I know for the I-9s, when we're doing audits of an I-9 and we find that we're missing information or we're finding that we need to do some corrections, we create a memo for each form that needs to be changed in some way. And on that memo form, we just we state what was changed and why. So that's also something that could happen if for some reason you lose that information, creating a memo that states that you lost it, there was a fire on this date, and we've recreated that. So going back to the employee and requesting that they complete their new hire documentation again is one way to kind of fix that situation. Of course, it doesn't help if you have disciplinary actions or reviews that are missing. Hopefully there's an electronic backup of that, which I think at this point, most companies do have those files stored in addition to paper files if they're using paper files.